January 17th, 1943. The air inside the B-17 flying fortress named Maiden's Prayer was so cold that breath turned to ice crystals before it could leave a man's lips. In the waist gunner's position, Staff Sergeant Thomas Whitley pressed his face against the plexiglass window and watched the contrails of 37 other bombers stretch across the pale morning sky like chalk lines drawn by the hand of God. Below, somewhere beneath the quilted clouds, lay the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, factories that fed the Wehrmacht's war machine, rail yards that moved its armies, refineries that fueled its tanks. And between those targets and the men of the 91st Bombardment Group hung only the thickness of aluminum skin, the accuracy of their Norden bomb sights, and the slim mathematics of survival that grew thinner with every mission. Whitley's fingers, even through heated gloves, had lost most of their feeling an hour ago. The temperature outside hovered at 58 degrees below zero. Inside, despite the makeshift heating system, it rarely climbed above 20. 50 caliber machine gun, and tried not to think about the numbers. 10 men crammed into a metal tube, 4 engines that had to keep turning, 250 miles of enemy territory still ahead, and somewhere in the pale winter sky, German fighters were already climbing to meet them. This was the arithmetic of strategic bombing, a calculated wager that a democracy could build machines faster than a dictatorship could shoot them down. But for the men inside those machines, mathematics dissolved into something more primitive, cold and fear, and the desperate human need to keep functioning when everything, altitude, temperature, velocity, and the entire Luftwaffe conspired to stop them. The B-17 flying fortress represented America's answer to the question of how to strike at the heart of Nazi Germany before Allied armies could reach it.
When the Boeing engineers first conceived the aircraft in 1934, they imagined a defensive weapon, a long-range bomber so heavily armed that it could fight its way to any target and back without fighter escort. The name Flying Fortress came not from Boeing, but from a Seattle journalist who watched the prototype bristle with machine gun positions and understood that this was not merely a bomber, but a statement of intent. 50 caliber machine guns and requiring a crew of 10 specialists to operate. Those 10 men were not merely passengers, but components of a flying weapons system. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot fought the controls against winds that could gust to 200 miles per hour. In the nose, the bombardier crouched over the Norden bomb site, the Army Air Force's most closely guarded secret, a mechanical computer so precise that bombardiers were instructed to destroy it rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Behind him sat the navigator, plotting their course across a continent with only dead reckoning, radio bearings, and occasional glimpses of the ground through gaps in the clouds. 50 calibers. 2 waist gunners stood in the widest part of the fuselage, exposed to slipstreams that roared through open windows at 200 miles per hour. The ball turret gunner curled into a plexiglass sphere beneath the aircraft's belly, suspended between heaven and earth, with only the thickness of his turret between himself and a 4-mile fall. The radio operator monitored communications while ready to man his own gun. And in the tail, isolated and alone, the tail gunner watched the sky behind him for the fighters that preferred to attack from astern, where the B-17's fuselage provided the largest target. They had trained together for months, first learning their individual positions, then slowly welding themselves into a crew. The Army Air Force understood that a bomber crew was not a collection of individuals, but a single organism, and the training reflected that philosophy. Pilots learned to fly in formation, so tight that their wingtips seemed to overlap. Gunners fired thousands of rounds at towed targets until they could lead a fighter moving at 400 miles per hour with the instinct of a duck hunter. Bombardiers practiced with their Norden sights until they could theoretically place a bomb in a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet, though the reality of combat with flak and fighters and terror would make such accuracy a bitter joke. But nothing in training prepared them for the cold. The Army issued heated suits, but the suits required electrical connections, and the connections failed with brutal regularity at altitude. Frostbite became as common as fear. Men returned from missions with fingers and toes blackened, with ears and noses that had frozen solid at altitude and now wept clear fluid as they thawed. The medical officers at base logged the injuries with clinical precision. First-degree frostbite, characterized by numbness and white skin. Second degree, with blistering and tissue damage. Third degree, requiring amputation. 1 in 10 crewmen would suffer frostbite severe enough to require medical treatment. Some would lose fingers or toes. Some would lose more. And nothing prepared them for the flak. German anti-aircraft defenses over the Reich were the densest in the world. The famous 88mm gun, which had earned its reputation as a tank killer in North Africa, proved equally effective at high altitude. German gunners positioned their batteries in rings around every strategic target, sometimes 60 or 80 guns concentrated in a space of a few square miles. When the formations approached, the guns opened up in coordinated barrages, filling the sky with black puffs of explosive that bloomed like poisonous flowers against the pale winter light. Each burst created a sphere of jagged steel fragments moving at thousands of feet per second. The fragments could punch through aluminum skin like paper. They could sever control cables, they could tear through hydraulic lines and fuel tanks, and most horribly, through the soft bodies of the men inside. Pilots learned to recognize the sound of flak hitting their aircraft, a sound variously described as hail on a tin roof, gravel thrown against metal, or the clatter of a giant's fingernails drumming on the fuselage. They learned to watch for the telltale black bursts and to know from the color and density of the smoke how close the Germans were getting to their altitude. They learned that the worst flak was the flak you never saw, the shell that exploded directly beside your aircraft with a flash and a concussion that felt like the hand of God swatting you from the sky. And they learned that there was nothing they could do about it except hold formation, maintain their course, and hope that the mathematics of dispersal meant the fragments would find some other aircraft, some other crew, some other 10 men whose luck had run out. Lieutenant James Crawford, pilot of Maiden's Prayer, had completed 14 missions. He needed 25 to finish his tour, the magic number that would send him home, assuming home still existed by the time he got there. The odds were not encouraging. In January 1943, less than 1 crew in 4 completed 25 missions. The rest died, or were captured, or bailed out over England so badly wounded that they never flew again. Crawford knew the numbers because everyone knew the numbers. They were posted on the operations board, calculated in the ready rooms, whispered over beer in the officers' club. The numbers were the only truth in a war that dealt in deception and propaganda and the careful fiction that American bombers could end the war from the air without the massive casualties of trench warfare.
But Crawford had stopped believing in numbers somewhere over the Ruhr Valley in December, when Flak had killed his original co-pilot and left him flying the aircraft alone for 2 hours, while the rest of the crew threw everything they could out of the waste store to reduce weight. Ammunition cans, empty oxygen bottles, even their flak vests, though removing those vests violated every regulation in the book. They had made it back to England flying at 8,000 feet, with 2 engines out and a hole in the port wing large enough to climb through. Crawford had landed the crippled fortress at the first base they could find, greasing it onto the runway so gently that the ground crew couldn't believe the damage until they saw it in daylight. They had given him the Distinguished Flying Cross, they had given him a new co-pilot, and 3 days later they had sent him back into the sky. His new co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Martin Hayes, was 23 years old, 2 years younger than Crawford, and had exactly 43 hours of combat flying time. Hayes had grown up in Minnesota, where winter meant something, and claimed that the cold at altitude didn't bother him. This was a lie, but it was a useful lie, the kind of lie that kept crews functioning. Crawford recognized it because he told similar lies himself. He told his crew that the flak never came close. He told himself that 14 missions meant he was experienced, not that he was 11 missions away from going home. He told his wife, in letters that took 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic, that the war was going well and he was safe and she shouldn't worry. The entire apparatus of strategic bombing ran on lies, necessary fictions that made it possible to order men into the sky day after day to face odds that no rational person would accept. The truth, which no one spoke aloud, was that every mission was a coin flip.
The Army Air Force calculated loss rates as percentages, Acceptable attrition, they called it. But percentages meant nothing when you were inside the aircraft that caught fire, or when the fighter cannon shell exploded inside your radio room, or when your oxygen system failed at 25,000 feet, and you had perhaps 90 seconds before hypoxia stole your consciousness, and you slipped into a sleep from which you would never wake. This morning's target was the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. Ball bearings were the unglamorous heart of modern warfare. They made gun barrels rotate smoothly, tank turrets traverse, aircraft engines turn. Destroy Germany's ball bearing production, the planners argued, and you would cripple every factory, every vehicle, every weapon in the Reich. It was the kind of target that made sense in the clean mathematics of strategic bombing theory. It made less sense when you looked at a map and realized that Schweinfurt lay 250 miles inside Germany, beyond the range of any Allied fighter escort, in a region where the Luftwaffe had concentrated some of its best squadrons. The briefing officer had presented the mission with practiced confidence. The route would take them across the English Channel, over occupied France, across the Rhine, and into the heart of southern Germany. They would bomb from 25,000 feet in clear weather. The Norden site worked best in clear weather, when bombardiers could actually see their targets. They would face heavy flak over the target and should expect fighter opposition throughout the mission. Expected casualties, 10%. Acceptable losses in service of a critical strategic objective. The briefing officer had not mentioned that 10% meant 4 aircraft out of their 40-plane formation.
He had not calculated that 4 aircraft meant 40 men, dead or wounded or prisoners, or scattered across the frozen fields of Germany with parachutes that sometimes opened and sometimes did not. Crawford had listened to the briefing with the flat attention of a man who had learned to separate what was said from what was meant. Then he had walked to his aircraft through the pre-dawn cold and begun the pre-flight ritual that had become a kind of secular prayer. Check the engines, all 4 turning smoothly, no oil leaks, no unusual sounds. Check the control surfaces, ailerons, elevator, rudder, all moving freely through their full range. Check the bomb bay, 8 500-pound general-purpose bombs, fused and armed, ready to fall on men Crawford would never see, in a city Crawford would never visit, for reasons that made sense in Washington, but dissolved into blood and fire when translated into reality. His crew had assembled with the practiced efficiency of men who knew their roles, 50 calibers that covered the upper arc of sky. Sergeants Whitley and Jackson had taken their positions at the waist guns, opening the windows despite the cold because you couldn't fire through plexiglass. Sergeant Robert Morrison had squeezed himself into the ball turret, that impossible sphere of metal and glass that offered the best visibility and the worst comfort in the entire aircraft. Sergeant William Price had crawled into the tail position, isolating himself in the rear of the aircraft, where he would spend the next 8 hours watching for fighters and knowing that if the aircraft went down, he had perhaps 3 seconds to escape before the tail section tore away and took him with it. In the nose, Lieutenant David Brenner had settled behind the Norden bomb site and begun his own pre-flight rituals.
The Norden was a marvel of mechanical engineering, a system of gyroscopes and mirrors and precision gears that could automatically pilot the aircraft during the bomb run, keeping it steady and level while calculating the exact release point based on altitude, airspeed, wind, and the ballistic properties of the bombs themselves. Brenner had trained on the Norden for 6 months before ever seeing combat. He had been instructed that the device was so secret that he must destroy it rather than let it fall into enemy hands. He carried a thermite grenade specifically for that purpose, a grenade that burned hot enough to melt steel and would reduce the Norden to slag in seconds. He tried not to think about the fact that if the situation was desperate enough to require destroying the bomb site, it was probably also desperate enough that he wouldn't survive long enough to use the grenade. Beside Brenner sat Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell, the navigator, surrounded by maps and charts and the tools of his trade, compass, protractor, slide rule, and the latest weather forecasts that were already obsolete by the time they reached his desk. Mitchell's job was to guide them across 500 miles of hostile territory, much of it obscured by clouds, some of it deliberately camouflaged by the Germans, all of it defended by men who would kill them if given the chance. He would do this using dead reckoning, the ancient navigator's art of calculating position based on speed, direction, and time, supplemented by occasional radio bearings, and if they were lucky, visual landmarks glimpsed through breaks in the clouds. The margin for error was approximately 0. Navigate correctly, and they would reach the target, drop their bombs, and have enough fuel to return to England.
Navigate incorrectly, and they would run out of fuel over the North Sea, or wander into even heavier defenses, or simply get lost in the immensity of the European sky until their fuel ran dry and they had to bail out over whatever terrain happened to be below them. The formation had assembled over England in the pre-dawn darkness, 40 aircraft climbing through the clouds, each one maneuvering by instrument until they broke through into the clear air above, then sliding into position by watching the formation lights of their neighbors. It was flying that required absolute concentration and perfect trust. One mistake, one pilot who climbed too fast or turned too sharply, could trigger a collision that would take down 2 or 3 aircraft before anyone knew what had happened. And yet they did it every mission, in darkness and weather, with crews who were exhausted before they even crossed the English coast. Crawford had slid Maiden's Prayer into the number 4 position in the lead squadron, high and to the right, where they would be slightly above most of the flak, but also more exposed to fighters. Every position in the formation had its advantages and disadvantages. The lead aircraft had the best navigators and the most experienced crews, but they also faced the most accurate flak, since German gunners aimed at the leaders and let the barrage catch the followers. The low squadron flew through the turbulence and prop wash of the aircraft above them, but they also had better protection from fighters attacking from below. The tail-end Charlie, the last aircraft in the formation, had the loneliest job, flying in the fumes of 39 other aircraft, watching for fighters, knowing that German pilots loved to pick off stragglers. They had crossed the English coast at 10,000 feet, climbing steadily as they headed toward France. Below, the countryside had spread out in the tidy patchwork of fields and hedgerows that English farmers had tended for 1,000 years.
Crawford had felt the strange dissonance that always accompanied this moment, the knowledge that down there, people were eating breakfast, delivering milk, walking to work, living their lives in a world that bore no resemblance to the world at 25,000 feet. In 30 minutes, those two worlds would diverge even further. Down there, it would be another gray January morning. Up here, it would be fire and metal and terror. They had reached 25,000 feet over the French coast. At that altitude, the world looked clean and abstract, the ground so far below that it ceased to seem real, the sky so vast that it swallowed all sense of motion. But the cold was brutally real. Despite his heated suit, Crawford had felt it seeping into his core, making his fingers clumsy on the controls, making his thoughts come fractionally slower. Hypoxia was the other constant enemy at altitude. The human body was not designed for 25,000 feet. At that height, the air pressure was less than half what it was at sea level. Breathe normally, and you would be unconscious in minutes. The crew wore oxygen masks connected to bottles of compressed oxygen, but the masks were uncomfortable and the connections fragile. A crewman could knock his mask loose while moving in the cramped interior, or a piece of flak could sever an oxygen line, or the bottles themselves could run low if the mission ran long. The symptoms of oxygen deprivation were insidious: euphoria, confusion, a creeping lethargy that felt almost pleasant. Men had died of hypoxia while their crewmates worked 3 feet away, unaware that anything was wrong until they tried to call for help and got no response. The standing order was to watch your crewmates constantly. If someone stopped responding, if their movements became sluggish, if they seemed confused or euphoric, you grabbed them and checked their oxygen immediately.
But in the chaos of combat, with fighters attacking and flak bursting, and the entire aircraft shaking with the recoil of 13 machine guns, it was easy to miss the signs. Easy to lose a man to something as silent and invisible as thin air. They had crossed into Germany at 08:47 hours. Mitchell had called out the navigation point over the intercom, a brief, crackling announcement that might as well have been a declaration of war. From this moment forward, they were targets. Every German radar station was tracking them. Every fighter base in the region had been alerted. Every flak battery was calculating their altitude and speed and preparing to fill their flight path with steel. The first fighters had appeared 10 minutes later, specks against the high clouds to the east, climbing to intercept. Crawford had felt his chest tighten as he counted them. 8. No, 12. No, at least 20. The specks had resolved into shapes, into aircraft, into Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, the elite fighters of the Luftwaffe. They had climbed above the bomber formation, then dove in coordinated pairs, firing their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns, raking the bombers from nose to tail before pulling away and climbing for another pass. The intercom had exploded with calls, 50 calibers that shook the entire airframe and filled the interior with the smell of cordite and hot metal. Spent shell casings had bounced across the floor of the waist section, piling up in golden heaps. In the ball turret, Morrison had rotated his sphere to track an FW-190 that dove beneath the formation, squeezing off a burst that might have hit, might have missed, impossible to tell in the chaos. The fighters had pressed their attacks with a ferocity that shocked even experienced crews. German pilots knew that without fighter escort, the American bombers were vulnerable.
They attacked from every angle, from the nose where the B-17's defensive fire was weakest, from the sides where they could rake the length of the fuselage, from below where the ball turret gunner was the only defense, and from above where the top turret struggled to track fast-moving targets. They fired from close range, 200 yards, 100 yards, sometimes less than 50 yards, so close that crewmen could see the German pilots' faces behind their canopies, could see the muzzle flashes from their guns, could see the tracer rounds reaching out like fingers of light before they tore through aluminum and flesh. A B-17 from the low squadron had taken a cannon shell in the No. 3 engine. The engine had exploded in a gout of flame and black smoke. Crawford had watched the pilot feather the propeller, shutting down the fuel and oil to the dead engine to prevent it from catching the wing on fire, but the damage had been too severe. The wing had folded upward, snapping like a toy, and the aircraft had rolled onto its back and begun the long, tumbling fall toward the earth 4 miles below. Crawford had seen 3 parachutes open. The B-17 carried 10 men. 7 had died in the time it took to draw breath. The attacks had continued for 20 minutes, the longest 20 minutes of Crawford's life. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the fighters had broken off, not because they had been driven away, but because they had to land and refuel. The Luftwaffe had learned that the best tactic was to attack in waves. One group would hit the formation, expend their ammunition, and break away while a fresh group climbed to replace them. It meant the bombers never got a respite, never had a moment to breathe and assess damage and check on wounded crewmen. It meant that all the way to the target and all the way back, they would be under attack. In the brief lull, Crawford had called for damage reports. The responses had come back with practiced brevity.
They had been lucky. The formation around them had been less fortunate. Crawford had counted 3 aircraft missing from their original 40. Another 2 were trailing smoke, struggling to maintain altitude and position. The bomber stream had begun to stretch out, the faster, undamaged aircraft pulling ahead, the wounded ones falling behind, where German fighters would find them and finish them off. The target was still 30 minutes ahead, 30 minutes that felt like 30 hours. Crawford had trimmed the aircraft and let Hayes take the controls for a few minutes, while he flexed his hands and tried to work feeling back into his fingers. The heated suit had failed, probably a broken connection somewhere, and the cold had settled into his bones. His feet were numb, his face hurt from the oxygen mask. His eyes watered constantly in the dry air, and the tears froze on his cheeks. Below them, the German countryside had rolled past in its winter cloak, forests and fields and towns that looked like toy villages from 5 miles up. Crawford had tried not to think about the people down there, tried not to imagine what would happen when the bombs fell. The briefing officer had emphasized that this was a precision strike against a military target, but Crawford had seen bomb patterns before. He knew that bombs didn't always hit what they aimed at. He knew that when you dropped 8 500-pound bombs from 25,000 feet,
In a 40-mile-per-hour crosswind, the math became probabilistic rather than precise. He knew that the factories they were targeting stood in the middle of a city where people lived and worked and raised their families, people who had not asked to be born German any more than Crawford had asked to be born American. But that was a thought that led nowhere useful.
So he locked it away in the same mental compartment where he kept all the other thoughts that would paralyze him if he examined them too closely. Thoughts about the men he had seen die, about his own mortality, about whether any of this would matter in the end. He focused on the instruments, on holding formation, on keeping Maiden's prayer in the sky. At 09:52 hours, they had reached the initial point, the navigation landmark where the formation would turn onto the bomb run. From here to the target, the formation would fly absolutely straight and level, holding course and altitude no matter what. The Norden bomb site required stability to work its mechanical magic. Any evasive action would ruin the bombardier's calculations. So, for the next 10 minutes, they would become sitting ducks, flying a predictable path while every Flak battery in Schweinfurt fired at them. The Flak had begun immediately, black puffs appearing ahead of them, then surrounding them, then filling the entire sky with explosions that rocked the aircraft and sent fragments rattling against the fuselage. Crawford had gripped the controls and held the course, while his entire body screamed at him to break formation, to dive, to do anything except fly straight into that hell. Beside him, Hayes had called out the seconds. 30 seconds to release, 25 seconds. In the nose, Brenner had hunched over the Norden, making microscopic adjustments, his entire world narrowed to the crosshairs and the target creeping closer. The bomb sight had taken control of the aircraft, making tiny corrections to the autopilot, adjusting for wind and drift. Crawford's hands had rested lightly on the controls, feeling the aircraft move beneath him, no longer his to command. Brenner's voice had crackled over the intercom. 10 seconds, 5 seconds. The aircraft had lurched upward as 4 tons of bombs fell away.
Crawford had felt the release with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief because it meant they could turn away from the Flak. Horror because he knew what those bombs would do when they hit. 8 500-pound bombs, each one packed with Torpex explosive, each one designed to create maximum blast and fragmentation, multiplied by 40 aircraft. A rain of steel and fire that would obliterate buildings and machinery and human bodies with equal efficiency. But there had been no time to dwell on it. The formation had executed a coordinated turn, banking away from the target, while the Flak continued to pursue them. Another aircraft had been hit during the turn, the number 2 in the lead squadron, its entire tail section blown away by a direct hit. The bomber had pitched forward into a vertical dive, spinning as it fell, parts of it breaking away like leaves from a tree. No parachutes. 10 more men gone in an instant. The fighters had returned on the way home, BF-109s and FW-190s diving through the formation with machine guns and cannons blazing. The return trip was always worse because the bombers were lower on fuel, lower on ammunition, and the crews were exhausted. The gunners' hands were so cold they could barely grip their weapons. The pilots fought controls that felt sluggish and unresponsive. And the Germans knew that damaged bombers would struggle to keep up, making them easy prey. Maiden's prayer had taken hits during the final attack. A 20mm shell had exploded in the radio room, wounding Sergeant Peters and destroying the radio equipment. Another burst had stitched holes along the port wing, severing fuel lines and causing the number 2 engine to cough and sputter. Kowalski had worked frantically to transfer fuel from the damaged tanks before they lost it all, while Crawford had nursed the aircraft along at reduced power, feeling it sink gradually lower, trading altitude for airspeed to maintain formation.
They had crossed back into Allied airspace at 12:47 hours, and Crawford had allowed himself to believe, for the first time that day, that they might actually make it home. The fighters had turned back at the German border. The Flak had ceased. They were over Holland now, friendly territory, or at least less hostile, and ahead lay the English Channel and the green fields of England, and the concrete runway that meant safety.
But the number 2 engine had finally quit over the channel, and Crawford had feathered it and felt the aircraft settle lower, the controls growing heavier, the fatigue in his arms becoming a physical pain that spread through his shoulders and back. Hayes had taken over for a while, but he was less experienced, and Crawford had finally taken the controls back as they approached their base, trusting his own hands more than anyone else's. The landing had been controlled chaos. The hydraulics had been damaged, making the gear extension uncertain. The tower had cleared them for an emergency straight-in approach, and Crawford had brought Maiden's Prayer down through the gray English afternoon with 3 engines and damaged controls and a crew that had been in the air for 8 hours. The wheels had touched with a squeal of rubber, and Crawford had applied the brakes and felt them catch, and then they were rolling to a stop, and it was over. The crew had climbed out in silence. There was no celebration, no congratulations. They had survived, but that was not an achievement. It was simply luck, the arbitrary mathematics that meant the Flak had hit someone else's aircraft instead of theirs. 3 crews from their squadron had not returned. 30 men were dead or missing. Tomorrow there would be memorial services if there was time. Tomorrow there would be new crews to replace the lost ones. Tomorrow there would be another mission.
But that night, in the barracks, after the interrogation and the hot meal and the whiskey ration that was supposed to steady their nerves, Whitley had sat on his bunk and tried to write a letter home. He had wanted to explain what it had been like, the cold and the fear and the moral weight of dropping bombs on people he had never met. He had wanted to tell his mother that he was not the same person who had left Kansas 18 months ago. He had wanted to say something true, that the words had not come. How could he explain 5 miles of altitude to someone who had never been higher than the church steeple? How could he describe the sound of a bomber breaking apart to someone whose worst experience of violence had been a disagreement at a town council meeting? How could he convey the strange intimacy of killing at a distance, killing with bombs that fell for 90 seconds before they hit, killing people who were invisible and abstract until you allowed yourself to imagine them as real? In the end, he had written what everyone wrote. He was fine. The food was terrible but plentiful. The weather was cold and rainy, like Kansas in winter but wetter. He missed home. He hoped to be back soon. All the comfortable lies that made it possible to keep going. The B-17 Flying Fortress had been designed to project American industrial power into the heart of Nazi Germany, and in that narrow sense, it succeeded. Between 1943 and 1945, B-17s would fly more than 290,000 sorties and drop more than 640,000 tons of bombs on European targets. They would help destroy Germany's industrial capacity, disrupt its transportation networks, and undermine civilian morale. The strategic bombing campaign would kill an estimated 350,000 to 500,000 German civilians and leave every major German city in ruins. But inside each of those aircraft were 10 men who had not been designed for this.
Men who had grown up in Kansas and Minnesota and New York, in a country where wars were things that happened somewhere else, to someone else. Men who had enlisted or been drafted, who had trained for their roles with the earnest competence that democracy fostered, who had climbed into their aircraft day after day, knowing that the odds were against them, and doing it anyway because that was what was required. The survival rate improved as the war progressed, as tactics evolved, as fighter escorts became available, as the Luftwaffe was slowly bled white. By 1945, bomber crews had better than even odds of completing their tours. But in January 1943, survival was still a lottery, and every mission was a bet against the house. What sustained them was not patriotism, though that helped. It was not hatred of the enemy, though some felt that too. It was something simpler and more profound, the refusal to let down the 9 other men who depended on you. The pilot who held the aircraft steady through the flak because the bombardier needed those few seconds. The gunner who kept firing even with frostbitten hands because the fighters were still coming. The navigator who recalculated their course for the 3rd time because getting lost meant running out of fuel over the North Sea. The ball turret gunner who curled in his impossible sphere and watched the sky
and tried not to think about the fact that if they crashed, he would be crushed like an insect. They did it for each other, these 10 men in their flying fortress, and in doing so, they demonstrated something that the planners and strategists had not factored into their equations, that human beings could adapt to almost anything if they had to, that ordinary men could function at 25,000 feet in 58 below zero cold, could endure hours of combat, could face mathematical odds of death, and still climb back into the aircraft the next day. The war would end in 1945, with Germany in ruins and America triumphant.
Historians would debate the strategic bombing campaign for decades, whether it shortened the war, whether the cost in lives was justified, whether precision bombing had been anything more than a comforting fiction. But for the men who flew the missions, those debates were abstract. They had done what was asked of them. They had endured what seemed unendurable. And most importantly, they had brought their crews home, or had tried to, or had died trying. The B-17 Flying Fortress became a symbol of American air power, celebrated in films and books and museums. But its real legacy was quieter and more human. It was the memory of 10 men working together in impossible conditions. It was the knowledge that ordinary people, when asked, could do extraordinary things. It was the understanding that survival at 25,000 feet required not just technology and training, but something more fundamental: trust in the man beside you, and the stubborn human refusal to quit, even when every rational calculation said you should. In the end, that was the arithmetic that mattered, not the bomb tonnage or the loss rates or the strategic objectives, but the fact that 10 men had climbed into a metal tube at dawn and, against all odds, had brought each other home.